Greetings and salutations, my friend, and welcome to my analysis of the second chapter of Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. In the first chapter, we were briefly introduced to the concept of prenatal conditioning. At the start of this chapter, we are seeing an example of a postnatal conditioning. It all takes place in the decanting room, where the babies are being removed from their bottles or artificial womb. It can be seen as equivalent to a birth.
The infants were unloaded. Now turn them so they can see flowers and books. Turned, the babies at once fell silent, then began to crawl towards those clusters of sleek colors, those shapes, so gay and brilliant on the white pages. The swiftest crawlers were already at their goal. Small hands reached out uncertainly, touched, grasped, unpetaling the transfigured roses, crumpling the illuminated pages of the book. The head nurse, who was standing by a switchboard at the other end of the room, pressed down a little lever. There was a violent explosion, shriller and ever shriller. A siren shrieked. Alarm bells maddeningly sounded. The children started screaming. The faces were distorted with terror. And now, the director shouted, for the noise was deafening, now we proceed to rub in the lesson with a mild electric shock. He waved his hand again, and the head nurse pressed the second lever. The screaming of the baby suddenly changed its tone. There was something desperate, almost insane, about the sharp, spasmodic yelps to which they now gave utterance. Their little bodies twitched and stiffened. Their limbs moved jerkily as if to the tug of unseen wires.
This process is being repeated 200 times to make sure that we are conditioning a child to become an adult with a strong aversion towards flowers and books. The goal of this is to create a perfect Delta citizen, someone who's meant for factory work, menial work, and most of all doesn't ask questions. I wish to discuss this particular choice of the two things the Delta citizens should have aversion to, books and flowers. Why this specifically? I think the book is much easier to understand why, as is also presented in the book when one of the students says himself that he understands that, but why the flowers? Of course, the point of aversion towards books is that books create a distraction from what a Delta citizen should be focusing on, his repetitive menial job. You know, a Delta citizen, a Delta worker, doesn't have time to read books. That's reason number one. The second reason is that if Delta citizens, or Gamma citizens for this matter, because Epsilons actually can't read, they're the lowest rank in the Brave New World social hierarchy. They don't have ability to read or write, but Deltas and Gammas, they can read, they can write, and they have some capacity of thinking. So if a Delta citizen starts to read books, he might start to think, and this is not something the world state of the Brave New World actually wants, because a citizen like that might start asking questions, might even start to develop critical thoughts of this whole system, this whole power system and hierarchy system, and question about himself and his identity that has been enforced on him or her. That's not something they want, obviously. So in order to create that perfect prison without actual bars and fences, they create this sort of aversion in an individual from very young age to make sure that they don't read, and it doesn't matter that they can read technically, they still won't. They might read instructions and so on. They might read text. that appears somewhere on a billboard or anything like that. They might read cafeteria menus, but not books. Books is this specific thing that they will always equate with something very unpleasant.
I actually haven't read any book. Reading is like eating Brussels sprouts for me.
As for the flowers, the book suggests that the world state wants Delta citizens to have an aversion to nature. I think this is partially because you want these type of workers to thrive in a factory environment, in an industrial environment, urban environment, and just like books are distraction from work, so is nature, unless they have been conditioned to become farmers, there is absolutely no reason for them to like flowers or nature. The second reason might be because appreciation of nature may create a level of individuality in those people. As I discussed in my analysis of the first chapter, there is no room for individualism among the Delta and Epsilon citizens and Gamma citizens to some degree. They're all clones of each other, both literally, as we see when the students are entering the room at the beginning of this chapter. All those babies are identical in the sense the way they look. They're literal clones of each other, made from the same cells. But they're also clones of each other in terms of the personalities, abilities, and their psychology. You sort of want to create an identical army, well, not a literal army, but you know what I mean, of Delta citizens. Well, sure, if they stop focusing on their task, if they spend time in nature, or if they read books, they develop their individual thoughts. We don't want that, right? But when I'm reading this passage, I'm seeing something more than mere description of this concept of the Brave New World society and world state. I'm also seeing something that might tell us more about Aldous Huxley. Huxley lived in a post-industrial society. Industrial revolution already happened. Industrialists are holding very high positions in the society, as we're going to discuss soon. And it seems like this contrast between the technology and the society and the nature are now more visible than ever before. And we have never been as separated from nature as until the Industrial Revolution happened, in general industrialization of society. So does technology and industrialization actually take away from individualism? I think that is a good question we should explore. And I think it's a very common theme in philosophy of technology and dystopian literature as well, this contrast between nature and technology and individualism. On one hand, I do spend a lot of time in nature. I love going for walks, and you might find me sitting somewhere on a rock next to a lake, looking at that lake, or closing my eyes and meditating, just thinking about stuff. Most of the ideas I develop by just sitting somewhere in nature and just thinking. I think there's a good reason to believe that, yes, contact with nature actually develops individualism to some degree, but I think a lot of the time we also overestimate it, or we romanticize it too much, as if it's this magical thing. Because before Industrial Revolution happened and we were much more in contact with nature, it was seen as just something normal. But I think at this point, when it's something like you have to go out of your way to be out in the nature, we think of it as special, sometimes like magical. And there's a lot of people who are interested in philosophy of technology who have this notion that we need to deprogram ourselves by being more in touch and in contact with nature. Is it possible to develop a level of individualism through technology? a lot of the time we actually consume the same content. We listen to the same music on the radio, right? And a lot of the time sure, if you're genuinely interested and you're looking for specific artists in the world of music, you will develop your tastes. You will listen to what you want to listen to. But a lot of the time, with music videos and radio and so on, and now, you have iTunes charts and all that, what you're listening to is largely decided for you. And it's not necessarily that the artists you are listening to are also the best ones. There just happens to be the one who are easy to sell. It's all decided for you. You don't really choose what you're listening to unless you go out of your way. And it's sort of the same with nature right now. You have to go out of your way to be out there. And I think the reason why we might associate nature with individualism and post-industrial society, unlike the pre-industrial society, is that it is something you have to go out of your way to do. And I think that is the core of why we associate individualism with that. Because it's in the same way that to develop your individual taste in music, you have to stop focusing on what's on the charts, what's the top 10 hits this month, what's on the radio, what's on MTV. Actually, no, I'm sorry, MTV doesn't really play music anymore. I don't think it has been doing that for a long time. But technology also gives us access to practically all the books, all the texts that have ever been written in a history of mankind. And it's a huge ocean. And if you throw yourself in it, you can read whatever you want, whatever interests you. There's just so much room for individualism. I don't think that technology and industrial or digital society at this point actually enforces us to be identical. It's just that it's both easier and harder to have like the individual thoughts than ever before at the same time. And it also happens that this sort of conditioning, maybe not on the same level as what we're seeing in Brave New World, has been largely happening through media. Television first played a big part of it. Then when the internet and eventually social media came on, when it showed up, that was a huge game changer, right? Now, our opinions are dictated by the media, We are being told what to think. And if you happen to have a different opinion than that, which is mainstream, or sometimes even that which is acceptable, you might even be considered a horrible person or a very stupid person because you do not believe in what is being told. This has some overlap with another dystopian novel, 1984, by George Orwell, which I also mentioned in my analysis of the first chapter briefly. But the difference is that in the world of 1984, what you're supposed to think is very strongly, very enforced in a totalitarian way, through surveillance and lack of information. Whereas in the Brave New World, it's very different, right? Because you're conditioned to actually like your position. You are conditioned into thinking that you want to think what they want you to think. So different means, but the goal is really the same. They both end up at the same point, even though the paths may be a little different. However, I think that our society that we are living in today, while it has some similarities with the society of Brave New World, such as, well, yes, we have access to a lot of information, but a lot of the time we actually don't care. We're being too distracted or programmed to focus on specific things. But I think there's one thing that is in this passage of the second chapter that is nowhere near what direction society actually took from that point. Notice that at no point here is what they're doing to those Delta babies considered child abuse. Since Huxley's times, we as a society have been becoming more and more aware of such things, and we don't like it. And with each decade, it seems that we are becoming more and more aware of what is harmful to children. I mean, the very fact that teachers stopped beating kids up at school, that made a huge difference. But you know, I still remember being a young child in Poland at a preschool. We had this one substitute teacher that was throwing shoes at us. And well, in today's society, she would be fired, and she would probably never be able to find a work at another preschool ever again. But back then, it was considered completely normal. However, in the society of the Brave New World, it's not considered child abuse to electroshock children, expose them to loud noises that would cause trauma and possibly even damage their hearing. Nobody cares. It's even noted that one of the students in this book is actually reacting with an admiration for the very process. Another thing that this types of conditioning assures, even though it's partially also done through genetic engineering, but this sort of prenatal and postnatal conditioning assures even more that there is no way to move in the hierarchy, in the social hierarchy of Brave New World. You can't move from one caste to another. That's just not gonna happen. Let's move to a different passage from this book.
There was a silence. Then, clearing his throat, once upon a time, the director began, while our Ford was still on Earth, there was a little boy called Reuben Rabinovich. Reuben was a child of Polish-speaking parents. The director interrupted himself. You know what Polish is, I suppose? A dead language, like French and German, added another student.
Here we learn that Polish, German and French are now considered dead languages.
You must get kurwa some code because I not give you kurwa this PC kurwa.
Un gros sac à et tu vaux pas mieux qu'elle. Putain, de ta mère, va.
Which makes it seem that in the world state that exists in the Brave New World, English is both a dominant language as well as culture. Other languages and cultures have been largely eradicated. So I think it also contributes to this whole society being identical, having the stability in that monolithic identity and community. However, we later get to learn that there are certain places in the world where those cultures and languages do exist, but we get to talk about it in other chapters much later on. In this part that I've just read, we also hear the name Ford, and obviously that refers to Harrison Ford.
Also, her mit Harrison Ford.
Oh, sorry. I messed up big time, eh? Obviously, the name Ford refers to Henry Ford, an industrialist and businessman who was alive during the time when Aldous Huxley was writing this book and published this book. I think, you know, this position of someone being an industrialist, playing this important role in society, and I think it tells us even more about the way Huxley viewed this industrial society. Is, you know, now during Huxley times, monarchy has largely fallen in most countries, and in few countries that still had monarchy, it was more symbolic than representative. And industrialists were sort of an emerging class in 1800s and 1900s. It seems that in the world of Brave New World, Henry Ford is a revolutionary figure, and just how much this industrial movement shaped the future of society, or the present of the society in Brave New World. And I find it very interesting that they refer to him as our Ford. I think that's obviously a play on the phrase our Lord, which may also tell us something about the way Ford is being viewed in this society. That he literally holds the position of a god. Industrialists are the new gods.
And parent? Questioned the director of hatchery and conditioning. There was an uneasy silence. Several of the boys blushed. They had not yet learned to draw the significant but often very fine distinction between smut and pure science. One, at last, had the courage to raise a hand. Human beings used to be... He hesitated. The blood rushed to his cheeks. Well, they used to be viviparous. Quite right. The director nodded approvingly. In brief, the director summed up, the parents were the father and the mother. The smut that was really science fell with a crash into the boy's eye-avoiding silence. Mother, he repeated loudly, rubbing in the science, and leaning back in his chair. These, he said gravely, are unpleasant facts, I know. But then, most historical facts are unpleasant.
This is probably one of my favorite concepts in this chapter specifically, because we take family for granted, right? I think there's a lot of things we take for granted, mostly because we are programmed and brainwashed to exist in a certain culture, to view certain things a certain way. Whether we like it or not, we're all conditioned in certain ways. And you see that this society in this book is also conditioned, just in a very different way than we are. So for them, it's hard to grasp the concept of a parent. It's an uncomfortable truth for them, just as for the people reading this book, especially at the time when it first came out, it was also very uncomfortable to even think of it as, the future in which kids have no parents. Kind of a terrifying idea, almost. And I think it could have been also Huxley's criticism of how industrialism reduces the role of a parent in modern society. Also, it could have been criticism of communism at the time, which held this anti-family rhetoric. And today it is one of some parents' greatest fears, that the government and the school are raising their kids for them, Even though I don't think that a parent owns a child. I don't think that a child belongs to a parent, and I don't think that adults have rights to children. I think that children have rights to parents. And I think that it is a parent's responsibility to raise and protect a child, rather than a privilege to have a child. I don't think that kids should be our property, our pets. But the extreme opposite end of that is where your child is being raised by the schools and the government completely, where they will even manipulate the child into thinking that what you teach them, the values you as a parent teach them, are wrong, maybe even evil, and they will also manipulate you as a parent into believing that you are a horrible person, that you don't know how to raise your child. They knew. However, I've noticed that a lot of conservatives who share that thought with me, because I definitely agree that this is something me and conservatives have in common, but I've noticed a lot of conservatives support this idea of nuclear family, as if that is the traditional family that always existed, when in fact it is an effect of industrialized society that Huxley has been living in during the time when he wrote this book. And I have talked about this early on this channel, but I'm a huge proponent of extended family. always have been. I don't think that nuclear families are the most perfect environment for a child to grow up in. But I believe I'll take a nuclear family, or a polyamorous family for that matter, over what we're seeing in the society of Brave New World, where a child has no parents and is completely conditioned and raised by the government. But let's now continue reading this part.
While the child was asleep, a broadcast program from London suddenly started to come through, and the next morning, to the astonishment of his crash and crash, the more daring of the boys ventured to grin at one another. Little Reuben woke up, repeating word for word a long lecture by that curious old writer, one of the very few whose works have been permitted to come down to us, George Bernard Shaw, who was speaking, according to a well-authenticated tradition, about his own genius.
George Bernard Shaw, whose speech Little Reuben was listening to, is an actual existing playwright that lived at the time of Huxley's lifetime. He's known for writing plays such as Caesar and Cleopatra and The Doctor's Dilemma. He was also pro-eugenics, which might have been a conscious decision on Huxley's part to include his name in this book, considering the content matter discussed in this book. The process of learning in your sleep, called hypnopædia, has been largely debunked already in 1950s. However, during Huxley's time, it was sort of an emerging phenomenon. A lot of people discussed, and a lot of people actually believed in it, and it found its way into this book. However, I think it also makes it a little unbelievable from today's perspective that the future society of Brave New World would be based on that, when that has, in fact, been debunked. While it is possible to recall some information, this idea that you can learn a new language in sleep is completely ridiculous. And it's strange to me that we still have this notion today that it is something that can actually happen. You have those a lot of videos on YouTube like that, apps and so on that do that for language learning. It's also completely not possible. It's just absolute bullshit.
The Nile is the longest river in Africa and the second in length of all the rivers of the globe. Although falling short of the length of the Mississippi, Missouri, the Nile is at the head of all rivers as regards the length of its basin, which extends through 35 degrees of latitude. At breakfast the next morning, "Tommy," says someone, "do you know which is the longest river in Africa?" A shaking of the head. "But don't you remember something that begins, the Nile is the longest river in Africa, and the second in length of all the rivers of the globe." The words came rushing out, although falling short of, "Well now, which is the longest river in Africa?" The eyes are blank. "I don't know." "But the Nile, Tommy." "The Nile is the longest river in Africa, and second..." "Then which river is the longest, Tommy?" Tommy bursts into tears. "I don't know," he howls. That howl, the director made it plain, discouraged the earliest investigators. The experiments were abandoned. No further attempt was made to teach children the length of the Nile in their sleep. Quite rightly, you can't learn a science unless you know what it's about.
Every time I read this part of this book, and I don't know if it's my own interpretation or if it's something that Huxley actually intended, I have no idea, but this is the way I interpret it, and since it's my analysis, I might as well include it here. But it often reminds me of the way school systems work. You know, the way how Tommy memorizes stuff, but he doesn't actually understand what he's saying. We don't really have to follow this path of learning in your sleep, this subconscious conditioning of information. Because at schools, and yes, sure, there are different teachers and there are different school systems in different countries. I found Norway, where I live, is actually much better at teaching kids to actually think, analyze information and have their own opinions. But when I grew up in Poland, we had none of that, We just had to memorize stuff. And this is something a lot of kids were doing, just memorize the stuff that is being on the test. And then you forget about it, right? That's part of the reason why actually most of the stuff I've learned on my own, out of my own curiosity. I always wanted my parents and my grandparents to buy me books. I loved talking with adults that were in possession of much more information and wisdom than I was, and I wanted to learn from them. But schools, it was like they teach you to memorize, they teach you to follow orders, but they don't actually teach you to think. And the case of little Tommy here is something I have seen and witnessed many times at kids who were my age at the time when I was growing up, when I was going to school. And a lot of the times, the teachers, they weren't particularly passionate about explaining things to us, to make us understand the concepts, to make us understand the connections, to make us think about all those concepts. They were usually just doing the minimal work required to get their paycheck, putting in minimal effort. Again, I don't know if it was Huxley's intention to criticize the school systems and the way we actually teach kids, but it could have been. I really don't know. In the final part of the second chapter, we learn that at the Center for Hatchery and Conditioning, kids, as they grow up, they also attend classes of sorts. It's also a sort of school. One of the subjects we are being introduced to here is elementary class consciousness.
A nurse rose as they entered and came to attention before the director. "What's the lesson this afternoon?" he asked. "We had elementary sex for the first 40 minutes, she answered. "But now it's switched over to elementary class consciousness."
And when we think of class consciousness, a lot of the time we think of this awareness of you being a certain class and class solidarity. A lot of the time it goes for the working class, the solidarity of the working class. Here, however, elementary class consciousness is yet another tool of conditioning people to like who they are, to like their position in society, and to ensure that they stay there.
Alpha children wear grey. They work much harder than we do, because they're so frightfully clever. I'm really awfully glad I'm a beta, because I don't work so hard. And then we are much better than the gammas and the deltas. Gammas are stupid. They all wear green, and delta children wear khaki. Oh no, I don't want to play with delta children. And epsilons are still worse. They're too stupid to be able to read or write. Besides, they were black, which is such a beastly color. I'm so glad I'm a beta.
And if you give a bunch of betas power, they're going to abuse it worse than anybody.
Because what's the better way of doing that than making sure that these kids and later on adults are conditioned and programmed into believing that it's best to be their particular class. You don't want to be above that and you don't want to be below that. And it also ensures that you don't form relationships or bonds with people of other classes and castes, because you will be thinking, what's the point? These people, we have nothing in common. I can't relate to them. And this also ensures that there is no movement between the classes in this hierarchy. Because if a gamma was to develop a bond, a friendship relationship with a beta, they might to start ask questions about their own position in this society. It's very effective in a way, and very messed up too. Alright, I think that was about it for the analysis of this chapter. I believe it was a little shorter than my first video in this series, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel, and I will see you next time. Take care and goodbye. Ciao.